Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to this second episode of Values Unpacked. Unpacking truths, inspiring purpose, and building lives one conversation at a time. I'm your co host, Irving Henry. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning on what we believe would be a meaningful conversation this morning.
All right, so I'm your other co-host. My name is John Chester and Irving. It's actually our third episode. Nonetheless, today we are joined by Dr. Wil Campbell, a well-known psychologist practicing out of Guyana. Dr. Campbell also serves as a lecturer at the University of Guyana and facilitates many conversations around the issue of mental health, education, learning, and is a staunch youth advocate. I hope that I was able to list all of your major fields, Dr. Campbell. For the purposes of today's discussion, we'll just be calling you Will. And is there any aspect of your practice that I may have missed that you wanted to share with us today?
I think you covered it well. Good morning, gentlemen. I think that you covered it all right. Maybe it might be helpful for some of our listeners to know that I have a background in education, having been a teacher and education administrator for upwards of 20 years before I migrated to the field of psychology full time.
Thank you for
Wow,
sharing that
I
with
never
us.
knew you were a teacher. So outside of your public life, and I think you have a very public life. Are you able to share with us, for those who may not be too keen of who you are, because we do have some folk who are not Guyanese,
Okay.
and so outside of your lectures, your conversations, and so on, and the many colorful socks that you usually post on Facebook, can you share with us who you are outside of when the lectures and conversations are over, and when the posting is finished? Who is Wil Campbell?
So most of the time when I'm not behind the lectern, I am home. And so I'm a bit of a homebody. I don't know how that happened over the years. I'm a husband. I've been married for 27 years. And I am the happy and proud father of two beautiful young women, beautiful, brilliant young women. And I thank God for them. So that's that's a big part of who I am when I'm not working. I'm an avid gardener. And so just 2 weeks ago, I revitalized my garden. And so as soon as I got up this morning, that's where I went. I'm a Christian, and that, I imagine, forms the foundation, the guiding principles for all of this, the work, the family life, the hobbies. All of it is underscored by the fact that I believe in God, and I believe that He has a purpose for all our lives.
Right.
Oh, all right,
John
and
mentioned your colorful socks. I try to compete with you, Will, but I don't think I can keep up. So today we want to focus our attentions a little bit on grief. I know that right now in Guyana we're dealing with a lot of grief surrounding the tragedy that happened, and we are elated, by the way, to have you with us and to lean in on your expertise in this area. So, when it comes to understanding grief, how do you define grief in a way that ordinary people can understand it? The human process rather than personal failure. How do you define grief?
All right. So the textbooks might say that grief is the physiological, psychological, and emotional response to loss. What that really means is that when we lose something that is significant to us, regardless of what that thing is, our bodies respond. And that affects our feelings, and that affects the way we think, and the way we're able to manage information and decision making. All of those areas are affected. And the purpose of all those internal and behavioral responses is our effort to make sense of this loss and to get to a place where we can be returned to a status of some kind of normalcy so that we can return to functioning again. So grief essentially is the way we respond to loss and the way we attempt to make sense of that loss and return to normal functioning.
Thank you. In terms of our preparation, we understand there are different types of grief. Can you talk a little more about that? How does that show up in our lives when we're grieving? How does grief show up?
All right. So we all respond in different ways, and those responses have a lot to do with where we are in life, what kind of experience we have, what we've gone through before, and how we've responded to those particular instances, and who we are as individuals. So, for example, there are people who, in grief, they collapse, sometimes literally, and sometimes figuratively. There are those people who their expression of grief is externalized in crying all the time, and then there are other people who would kick into action immediately. You know, some people in grief, that's when they become very energetic, and they're the ones getting everything done and taking care of all the arrangements and facing the public and that kind of thing. And then there are those who become silent. And some people, their response to grief is numbness. They don't feel anything. Some people feel guilty, especially in a situation where it might have been possible that they might have been the one who was lost. And so they feel like, you know, maybe it should have been me and not that other person. We refer to that as survivor's guilt. Others feel guilty because they feel like there were some things that they could have done or should not have done that they perceive may have contributed to the demise of the one who's lost. And so all of those are responses, and each of those responses is normal and legitimate. So if a person is experiencing any of those, they shouldn't feel like, or they shouldn't be made to feel like, you know what, why are you not crying? You're supposed to be crying. Something is wrong with you. Or why are you crying all the time? You need to man up or be strong. All of those responses are normal responses to grief. And we who may not be grieving in that way don't have a right. We don't have the authority to tell another person how they should feel about that situation.
So in other words, grief can show up in a way that we may not recognize it, is what I'm hearing you say. If some people might cry and some people might internalize it, we may not even know that they're grieving while they might be very well grieving in during a loss.
Correct. You know, the typical response to grief is tears and you know, a sense of devastation and depression. And so when people don't respond in that way, we tend to feel like, you know, something is wrong with their response. But grief does not show up in the same way in every person.
All right.
So I kind of wanted to ask you a follow-up question on that. As you've listed different ways in which people grieve, what tools do we can we acquire to kind of understand, hey, you know, person X may be grieving differently from person Y? Is there like a cultural thing that enables maybe a misunderstanding of how people should grieve? And what tools should people really be beginning in order to understand, hey, you know, there are different ways in which people grieve, and so you must understand it, you must appreciate the differences in the grieving process?
What I've found is that education, awareness is the most powerful tool that you could utilize in this situation when you're dealing with other people experiencing grief. Because if you don't know, particularly in our culture, we tend to have a very narrow understanding of what it should look like. So if we can step outside of that a little bit and inform ourselves as to how people grieve differently and what our response could look like, we would be better able to provide support for other people and maybe even help ourselves through the process. Because sometimes people doubt themselves, like, why am I crying all the time? Why can't I be strong like Irving? Or how is it that I'm not crying? You know, maybe John is feeling this more than me. Is there something wrong with me? So that understanding that is different, that awareness that it shows up in different ways, is very helpful even for our own process, because I mean, it's hard to deal with something when you don't understand your own response.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so this here, I think, is a good segue to cultural appreciation of grief. So my question to you is, how does culture and maybe even our faith background shape the way individuals experience and express grief?
All right, so I'm going to start with how culture can sometimes impede our ability to grieve in healthy ways. One of the things that I mentioned is the very narrow definition that sometimes culture imposes on what particular behaviors should look like. So you've lost someone, you should be crying, or you've lost someone, you should be strong. You're the eldest one, you're the man in the family, you need to be strong. And typically those responses are not helpful. Sometimes even our faith response is not helpful. So for example, a person is deeply grieved because of a bereavement, a loss, and you say to that person, don't cry, God knows best. And God does know best. And all things do work together for good, we Christians believe. But those are not the messages that a person needs to hear in that moment of intense grief. And so sometimes our cultural responses, including our faith responses, are not what is required in those moments. However, a lot of the things that we do culturally, the little rituals, are very helpful for people in the grieving process. One of the things that we do in our culture is we have the viewing of the body. That helps people to bring closure to a particular chapter, to a chapter in their lives involving the bereaved person or person. So the viewing of the body is helpful. The funeral, we have things like the wake that give people a kind of a window that helps to lead up to the finality of what is about to happen, of the experience that they're having. So these cultural expressions that we have, the funeral, the wake, the condolences, all of those help people to build a bridge between where they were before and where they're going to need to be in order to survive this loss. So our cultural practices are very important. And then there is the faith element. And even though during the grieving process, your faith can be shaken a little bit, that belief that there is a God who understands and who feels our pain and who provides support for us and who knows the end from the beginning, that helps people to manage the loss and the reality of that loss, and to bounce back and become more resilient. It has been found that people of faith tend to be more emotionally resilient and psychologically resilient than people who without those beliefs, without that kind of belief system.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And so when it comes to issues of values, those values that we hold dear, and I do believe that there is an interconnection between our values and the faith that we exercise, the faith that we hold dear to. In your experience, which core values tend to emerge or be even strengthened during the grieving process or during seasons of loss?
That's an interesting question. I think that an important core value that emerges is, and I'm not sure whether I should call this a value or a need, but the importance of social connection is important, and it emerges during that process, and compassion. Those are some of the areas that I think that come to the fore during this process. The importance of genuine social connection and compassion. And one of the reasons for that is when we're under stress, either the worst parts of ourselves emerge or the best parts of ourselves. And so if we have strong social connections, it helps us to navigate those difficult circumstances. And it helps us to know where we can lean for support during the process. And if we have compassion, and I'm referring now to those who are providing support, that's where you are able to give grace to that person who may not be functioning optimally, may not be functioning in the way that you're used to that person being. So if I'm known to be stoic and strong, and this particular situation has caused me to be inconsolable, the one who is compassionate will understand that Will is not always like this. He must be going through something really difficult. I need to provide support, as opposed to being critical and saying, what's going on with you? Will, this is not you. Get yourself together. That's not what I need in that moment. So compassion. And then there is also the self-compassion, because as I mentioned before, sometimes we have all kinds of self-doubt, we have all kinds of guilt, and we need to extend compassion to ourselves in our own moments of grief, even as we expect others to extend compassion to us.
You know, you
want to ask a
mentioned.
quick follow-up before.
Okay.
Go
ahead,
let me
John.
just have
Go
a
ahead.
quick follow-up there. So when people experience loss, and I'm not an expert on loss, I'm not an expert on grief, but I assume that sometimes people question their core beliefs, their core values when they experience these loss or experience grief. What would you suggest to people who are going through that process for, reconnecting with their core values when grieving makes them feel that sense of loss, or makes them feel lost and overwhelmed? Like, how do you propose that people find a reconnection to core values when those things happen?
All right. I believe, and this is my, should I say, professional hypothesis, that the human brain, I imagine, is grounded in my spiritual beliefs as well, that the human brain was not designed to deal with death. The human brain was never designed to have to deal with death, and for evidence, I look at the fact that we all know that we're going to die, that we have, our time here is finite. We all know that those around us will die, and sometimes we have ample warning. We have an ailing parent, and we know that at some point it's going to be the end, but that does not dull the pain. Knowing that doesn't dull the pain, and it's still, a lot of us still react in shock, even though we know that this is, this is something that's going to happen. So we're not designed to deal with that. And so the brain of itself does not know how to respond. And so it shakes up everything that you're used to, and everything that you believe sometimes. And so you get to a place where you start to question your own values. In fact, a lot of people will tell you that after having lost someone, their whole lives changed because they realize that their value system, or they perceive that their value system was not ordered the way it should be. And so having experienced that loss, that whole value system gets shaken. And then they determine that, you know what, I need to change this, I need to change that, I need to reprioritize, I need to, so those are some of the things that can happen. And there are those who doubt everything they believe. So for example, people of faith start wondering, this God who says he loves me, where is he now? If he cares for me, why did he let this happen to me? And all of those are normal responses. All of those are normal reactions. And it could be helpful if we understand that while we are in this place, we could be feeling this way. The other thing that we need to give ourselves, in addition to compassion, is time. It's time. So we need time to get to that place where we're more or less stable again. And then at that point, that's when we can reevaluate our value systems. We can reevaluate what we had as priorities and what we saw as important. But those decisions should not be made while we are in the depths of our grief. Because the part of the brain that is most active during deep grieving is not the part that is very good at decision making and problem solving and processing complex information. So you have
that's
to
very interesting stuff there.
Absolutely interesting.
Yeah, that's some really interesting stuff in terms of how the physiology of the emotions of grieving affects the physiology of our existence. That is really interesting stuff. But I want to touch back on part of your previous answer in terms of social connection and compassion. It kind of led into this question I wanted to ask in terms of community support. What role does our community play in sustaining someone who is grieving? What does that look like? How does compassion show up in our community as we grieve?
Right. So compassion has tangible elements and intangible elements. Compassion might be me coming over to my neighbor and sitting with him or her and just listening to them talk, or just sitting with them while they cry sometimes without words. So some compassion can look like that. Compassion might look like, I know that you usually take the cows out around this time, but I know that you're in no shape to do that. Let me take them out for you. Compassion might look like, I know that you have some running around and somebody has to go and go to register this information. Would you like me to drive you there? Compassion might look like, let me pray with you. Compassion will also look like me determining what is important in this moment. So sometimes when people are grieving, their behavior is, bad behavior. But that person doesn't need me to be their moral police in that moment. So sometimes compassion means letting somebody cuss up a little bit if that's what they're feeling right now. Even though, brother Henry, we don't curse. But that's not what you need to hear right now when you're in the throes of your grief.
Right.
So sometimes compassion says, okay, Brother Henry knows this, but he's really messed up right now. And that part of his brain that processes these higher order thoughts, that part of the brain is suppressed right now by overwhelming grief. And so he might not, do the right thing. So, and sometimes compassion means protecting people from vultures. Let's be real, there are some people whose morality is not in the right place, and they see this as the moment to prey on those people who are made vulnerable by their grief, whether it's in fighting for the estate of the deceased, or whether it's in dealing with some unfinished business from some previous time, and they feel like this is the best time to bring that up, or just simply raising inappropriate topics. Somebody might need to in compassion, step in and say, this is not the time for that. Let's leave that for another time. So,
Okay.
compassion has different faces, and sometimes it's tangible. Sometimes it's, I'm gonna take care of the meals for the repast, or I am going to purchase the pay for the tent for the wake. It has different faces, but compassion has its roots in love. And so I love this person that I'm supporting, and what can I do to support them in a very real way as they go through this difficult time?
Yeah, again, in terms of social connections, and we talked a little bit, you touched a little bit about spirituality and faith. If you would expand on that a little bit, especially as you talk about the moral police, because I think that sometimes we see this showing up most often in the faith community, right? They tend to, our church members tend to have a different view of how things should be, especially when we think about how the Bible tells us how to grieve. What role does the church community or faith community play in this process of grieving? How does our faith help us in making meaning after a loss?
So the church community. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of the support systems, and I believe that our churches, the faith community has a responsibility to provide support to its membership and members of the community who are in grief. All right, the Bible specifically says that this is, we should comfort those who mourn. And I believe that the foundation for that support should come from the biblical principle of expressing love by doing for people what we would want them to do for us if we were in the same position, same situation.
Absolutely.
All right. So that, I believe, should underscore our efforts to provide support as a faith community. So here's a question. If I am in the midst of my grief and I say something that might be off color, would I want someone to be preaching at me in that moment? Is that the immediate need?
Right.
And I think we have examples of, I can't think of an example in grief right now, but we have examples where Jesus pulled up his disciples about moralizing as opposed to taking care of needs. And so we have the situation where Jesus was getting ready for some kind of meeting with adult people, and the children came running in, and the disciples said, children are supposed to be here. And Jesus said, listen, let them come. And he spent some time with them, and he blessed them, and when their needs had been met, that's when he focused on the more grown folks things. And I believe that as Christians, sometimes we need to understand that particular priority. We need to understand that particular priority. So we have the story of the guy who was crippled in the Bible. The guy who was crippled, and when he was brought to Jesus, they wanted to discuss whether, this was the sins of his parents or the sins of whomever or his own sin. So the man needs healing. He needs healing. Let's take care of that immediate need. And so the faith community needs to come together and focus on immediate needs. We can deal with the moralizing and the spiritualizing and the legalizing and the ritualizing. Those things, we will deal with those after we have taken care of these immediate needs. And interestingly, those teachings, those faith teachings, align with the scientific teaching. Psychology says that if a person's basic needs are not met, then that person does not have the capacity to deal with higher order thinking and reasoning. And that was in the Bible before psychology was invented.
So allow the brother or the sister to take that drink, and to calm their nerves, and don't even mention it sometimes, right? You or deal with it some other time, but don't mention it during the process. Or in my case,
Deal with it another time.
for me,
Deal
yeah,
with
or
it
leave it
another
alone
time. Yes.
altogether.
Yeah. Deal with it another
Yeah.
time.
Mhm.
You're not going to encourage it, and you may not even want to support it, but
Yeah.
you certainly
Mhm.
don't. That person does not need you to moralize on that. Now, um,
Mhm.
Irvin, if God forbid you're going through a difficult time and I see you drinking, I'm not going to preach on you about it. I might hide the rest of your drink though.
Yeah. Yes. Please do.
But I mean that's very interesting. But how will taking action in that moment help him with the grieving process? If he's venting in the grieving process, and you're saying to him, and this is taking away his drink, using that analogy. If he's venting in that grieving process, and you're saying to him, or anybody else is saying to him, or anybody, hey, stop venting. Um, how does that help the grieving process? Shouldn't we allow the grieving person to go through that process before we intervene, or should we intervene at all?
Right. So the you have to kind of triage the situation. Is this something that is harmful in the immediate?
Okay.
Right? Is this
Mm.
harmful in the short term? So if I see you doing something as part of your grief journey that is going to cause harm in the long
Mm-hmm.
term, and particularly immediate harm, then I need to step in and prevent you from harming yourself or from harming others. If it is something
Yeah.
that will not, this is the time. So let me go back to the very terrible analogy that I used before, where Irving is drinking. And he says, uncle, whatever he wants to call me, I need to deal with this. I need, this is the only way I can. I'm not going to take away the glass he has in his hand, but I
Hmm.
might get rid of the bottle.
Right.
You understand? And after he has completed that
Absolutely.
glass, then I can divert his attention to something else that he could do to help him maneuver through this difficult process. All right? Because listen,
Mhm.
if I feel like I feel like I've gone down a rabbit hole here. But if I feel like um, this drink is what I need right now, this is the only thing that can stabilize me, and you try to come between me and that drink, that's a whole different conversation. I can't listen to you anymore.
Yeah.
Nothing you say makes sense to me
Hmm.
anymore because
Mhm.
my brain stem, my survival brain says, you have now become the enemy.
Mhm.
Right. So
Ah.
very
Mm.
often in
Mm.
our efforts to help people, we become their enemies. And if we understand how the human brain works, it helps us figure out what steps to take and what to do first and what to do next. If I trying to take away your drink, now you can't listen to me. You can't hear me because I have trapped you in survival mode. And very often the bridge between a person's survival mentality, which is really an animal part of our brain, the part of the brain that's common to humans and animals. That's where we are when we're in survival mode. And the part of our brain that makes us human, which is the prefrontal cortex. Humans have the largest prefrontal cortex uh, by volume. Um, the bridge between that and survival is very often understanding. So if I feel like you understand me and you validate my experience and you sympathize with what I'm dealing with, I can now shift from survival because now I feel safe with you. And so when I've
Mm.
shifted from survival and I'm moving um, closer to cognition and reasoning, now you can say to me, yeah, this would it would be really easy for you to get hooked on drinking right now. So I've put away a drink.
Mm.
And if you need to,
Mhm.
if you need a hand, call me and we can find something for you to do so that that you don't suffer too much. At that point, I can reason with you because now you're my friend. You're on my side. You understand me. You've heard me. You've listened to me.
I want to follow up on that and want you to expand a little more. Not specifically on that, but earlier in one of the first questions, we talked about education and educating people. This stuff that you're sharing here is so enlightening and informative. Um, how do we get our people to understand these things? How do we disseminate this information so the wider population, in our communities understand this? Because I can imagine a lot of damage is being done when
Yeah.
people are in the process of grieving, while
Yeah.
in a good attempt to help. We all mean well. How do we educate our community about
Mhm.
these things?
I think that situations like the one that is topical in Guyana right now, uh, these situations form a good catalyst for continued and ongoing educational um, efforts. So this is happening now, and we're hearing from different uh, experts and practitioners in the area. Why not let us continue this conversation so that other people get to hear it? Because typically we only do
Yeah,
this um, reactively.
yeah,
So, and this particular podcast has just started, so this is not an indictment on this effort here. But we very likely will not have been having this conversation had the MV Barima not gone down 2 weeks ago. Most of the
very
people
Absolutely. You're
that I
true.
have
absolutely
had
correct.
Very
conversations with
true.
will not have been having these conversations then. But now
Mhm.
that this
Mhm.
has happened, we are now aware that these are conversations that need to be had. So let us,
Yes.
even after
Yes.
this has normalized, continue to have these kinds of
Mhm.
discourses and discussions. Because the truth, in reality,
Mhm.
we learn best when our hearts are at ease. And so
Mhm.
there
Mm,
are people who might be watching this right now who will not glean as much as they could have because they are grieving. So let's
mhm.
have ongoing conversations of this nature so that people can consistently be made aware of these things so that when you are in the crisis, you know exactly how to respond.
Thank you.
Yeah. You mentioned the MV Burima, and for those who may not be aware of what is happening in Guyana, a ship with a number of persons sank off Guyana's coast. And so there were families that were unfortunately affected, like almost entire families that were wiped out in that incident. And um, I want to ask you a question about that. Um, because this grieving is happening in the public space, and there's a lot of distraction, not just public commentary, but issues related to information and logistics and even politics and so forth, right? It's all encompassing. In situations like this, are families really able to grieve effectively and find closure when all of this is happening in the public space and there's so much distraction? Are those affected families able to really
Mm.
grieve properly and find closure?
You know, that's a really legit. An important question. There's a reason why famous families or families who, for whatever reason, have been thrown into the public space, into the public sphere, ask for privacy during their grieving process. Because all of these different voices complicate the process. Remember that I need my mental and emotional resources to be focused on helping me go through this difficult circumstance. So when you start to talk to me about politics, and you start to talk to me about logistics, and you start to talk to me about ferry services and the legal aspect of this, and you bring all of that in, my brain cannot focus on what is important to me right now, what is most urgent, which is grieving this loss.
Yeah.
And so all of these extraneous elements in this discussion, all of them just combine to make it difficult. So what could very likely happen is 2 years down the line, this conversation is still ongoing. So I still haven't grieved. And typically, grieving occurs, the bulk of a person's grieving occurs in the first 6 to 9 months after the loss. Now, if in the first 6 to 9 months, the conversation is diverted to all kinds of other things, you can see how I'm postponing that grieving process. And in so doing, I am prolonging and extending and complicating a process that my brain might just have 6 months to do. So by the time we get to that place, I am so messed up that I have difficulty returning to normal functioning. And so now I have anxiety or depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and certainly post-traumatic stress disorder. Now I have a mental illness or mental disorder on top of the grief that has not been processed.
That is absolutely mind-blowing in many ways. And so our prayers continue to be with those families well, and we really hope that they are able to find closure. But talking about closure also, when we talk about grief, it means that there's been a rupture, which also begs the question of when would healing happen. And so my question to you is, does healing from grief mean merely moving on, or is it more accurate to think of grief and the grieving process as learning to move on?
Yeah, I think in your question, you've answered it better than I probably would have. So grief is not moving on, because you never really overcome, in the context of losing a loved one, you never really overcome that loss. And for example, I have experienced situations where parents in their 90s saw a photograph or were drawn into a conversation about their child that they had lost 70 years ago. And they were crying as though it just happened. So you never overcome it, really. You never overcome that loss, but you learn how to manage without that person. So like you correctly stated, grief is more about learning how to deal with the loss than dealing with the loss. However, you do get to a point eventually where there is some measure of closure and acceptance, and you're able to return to a measure of normalcy. By the way, it's now your new normal. So you're able to, over a course of time, formulate your new normal. And so the average person in 6 months, 9 months, maybe 12 months, and I don't know why we tend to move in multiples of 3. Somewhere along that timeline, we're normal again. If at the 12-month, somewhere between 9 and 12 months, an individual is still in the same emotional space they were when they got the news of the loss, then it becomes what we call in psychology complicated grief. And that suggests that there are some circumstances, some underlying circumstances that have not been dealt with, that are, those circumstances are not allowing that person to move, to graduate to the point where they are now able to cope. And so at that stage is where people need psychological and sometimes psychiatric help.
Okay, I was going to ask about that. And so which says to me that there are barriers to healing. And so what beliefs, what habits are most common in those cases where healing is blocked, and how can people gently work through them?
Right. That's a complex question, because the barriers are, there's a long list of barriers. I'm going to try to itemize the ones that come to memory. Guilt is a big barrier to grief, or any form of what I call unfinished business. So, for example, in the case of a husband and wife, we had plans, and we were never able to, those plans will never materialize. So now I have to go back to the drawing board and start over, because this plan never included just me. So there is that. There is the unfinished business aspect of it. There is the guilt that I could have done something to help you, or I think that I should have been able to do something to save you, and I was not able to do that. That could be problematic. Another problematic thing would be a lack of proper social support. And sometimes the social support shows up in numbers, but not in quality. And so lots of people show up, and everybody's helping me do something, but the words that they are saying, the things that they're telling me are not supporting my grief process. In fact, some of them are making things worse for me. So now you've introduced ideas into my mind that make it more difficult for me to go through this. So those are some of the things that can cause a person to be. And another thing would be a personal degree of resilience. And there's so many things that affect a person's resilience. But if a person has had a lifetime of trauma, for example, and abandonment, and this person that they've now lost is the one person that they depended on for support, you can see how that can be problematic.
Yeah.
This is the only person in my life that has meant this for me, and now they're no longer there. I feel like I can't carry on. People who have a history of depression and anxiety, they're already vulnerable, and then you add this loss on top of that, more difficult, a greater degree of difficulty. So there's so many things that can delay and complicate grief and make it difficult for people to go through during and I'm using the word timeline loosely here, because there really is no timeline for grief. But there's, on average, people somewhere around that 9-month mark are able to start living again.
So there's so many questions that are coming to my mind to ask, but our time is limited. We don't have unlimited amounts of time. But I want to ask this question before I go to the next question, as we begin to wind down to get to more practical things. We've been talking about grief in relation to death. Are there other events that lead to grief as well? And what might some of those events be?
I'm glad you asked that question, because grief, as we defined at the start, is a response to loss. And it could be loss of anything. So it could be the loss of a job. It could be loss of a person's identity, and that could happen in a lot of different ways. So we define ourselves in some ways by the work that we do, for example. And so if I lose that, then I feel like a part of my identity is lost. So grief. That loss of identity also occurs if I lose someone, because, and God forbid you pray for me, but if I lose my wife, I'm no longer Dee's husband. So that side of me is lost. So I lose a part of my identity. So there's so many things that can cause a person to lose their identity. So loss of identity. It could be loss of a pet. It could be loss of a friendship. It could be loss of a relationship. It could be loss of income or finances.
Yeah.
All of those losses invoke a period of grief. And the grief occurs in pretty much the same way. It is just that humans are a little less sympathetic if it's not the loss of a human being. And so when people lose it, in those kinds of areas, they find themselves largely alone because nobody sees that as something that you should be grieving over. You know, get yourself together. It's just a job. You could always get another job. You know, those are the kinds of responses we typically get, which might be a lot more sympathetic if we'd lost, a loved one.
Yeah. So with a better understanding now of grief, that grief can happen in various ways outside of death. Our platform is about values. So what practical guidance can you give us, our audience, for someone to begin reconnecting with the values that can sustain them during these periods of grief?
Awesome. We're all going to experience loss in our lives repeatedly. And while we may not be prepared to deal with some of those losses, we can build a level of resilience that will allow us to bounce back from those losses. One of the ways of doing that is in finding your identity and in defining yourself in, pardon me if I get a little preachy here, but in whom God created you to be, as opposed to defining yourself by the things that you've acquired or achieved or the people that you have around you, because those things are fleeting, really. So we have to learn to define ourselves by what lasts, and the only thing that lasts are those things of God. So that's one thing. Another thing is to build your faith so that you have one more thing to lean on in those really shaky experiences. Right? So build your faith, build your understanding of who God is. Do those things while you are in a good space. That's when we tend to forget about those things, but that's when we need to really build it up, because we're going to need those reserves in those difficult times. So work on building your faith. Another important thing that I think we forget sometimes is to establish strong social support systems. We need people. And even in those times of bounty and plenty, those times of ease, when we forget that we need people, we need to continue to build strong relationships, because nobody's life, is mountaintop all the time. There are valley experiences, and we can need those people in the valley experiences. And sometimes the way to build that is to be supportive with other people in their valley experiences. Related to that is that when we help people, we are essentially depositing into our compassion accounts. So every time I help someone, I am making a deposit into someone else's helping me when I need it. And it is important to understand that your help doesn't always come directly from the person or persons that you have helped. Sometimes we look for those people to be grateful. It's not always going to happen that way. But if you are kind and compassionate and helpful and generous, it will come back to you. So these are things that we can. These are some of the things that we can do in our effort to get to a place where we are supported when we are in need. Another important thing too is to deal with our own traumas, because every unhealed trauma weakens you and makes you less resilient. And sometimes we forget traumas instead of healing them. In fact, society pushes you to forget it. Ah man, forget about it. Don't worry, that's in the past. But it's bothering you. So we push it to the back of our minds, and then it is triggered when the next crisis comes up. So now in this crisis, I'm not just dealing with this crisis, but those unresolved hurts that I've been pushing to the back of my head that I should have processed and worked through. And sometimes in order to deal with those, you need to go see a therapist. And I almost feel guilty every time I say this because it sounds like I'm trying to advertise my services, but I'm not. We need, some of us need to go sit with somebody, and there's nothing wrong with that.
That's
nothing
right.
wrong with that.
That's right.
So if you have all this baggage carrying in the background, when a present crisis comes up, it triggers all those things that you thought that you had forgotten. So now you're carrying this plus all those other things, and it becomes even more difficult to recover. So those are some of the things that we can do in preparation, because we can lose things as we go along. We will suffer loss in our lives, and many of us repeatedly. And we need to have a cushion, some kind of support.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Campbell, we are definitely honored that you were able to take the time to be with us today. This is such a rich discussion. Like I said before,
Absolutely.
I wish we had more time to continue this. But we know that you are a generous person and you give so much of yourself. And we would love to have you back on our platform sometime in the future. Where we can talk more about other issues, other values that affect our lives, things that affect our lives, especially surrounding mental health. We know that you have a lot of expertise in that area, so we just want to say thank you for such an inspiring time with us this morning, and may you continue to do the good work that you're doing to change lives and to bring inspiration to so many. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for having me. Thank you for having me, and please keep doing this work. What you're doing here is great stuff, and blessings on this journey. I'm pretty sure I am confident that coming out of this, there will be lots of healing. There will be lots of there's gonna a lot of people will gain valuable knowledge and resources that they can use to make their lives better. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely, Dr. Campbell. As a matter of fact, yesterday I was having a conversation with a friend, and I shared with that friend our YouTube link for this program today. And you know what that friend said? She said to me, well, you know what? I'm going to look at it because I was talking to someone about grief. That person lost a father, and that person still has, it's still in the grieving process. So I really hope that, something that you've said today will form part of the healing of that individual who is still grieving the loss of her dad. But, it's always power-packed hearing from you. I hope that you will continue in the journey that you're on, and that you will continue inspiring so many people. Thank you again, Dr. Campbell. To our listeners and viewers, we also thank you for listening. This has been Values Unpacked. We hope that you stay curious, stay grounded, and keep unpacking the values that shape your life. We look forward to being with you in our next episode, which will be episode 4. Please do remember to share our podcast to your platforms and support the work that we're doing by subscribing to our YouTube channel. We are also on StreamYard, Podbean, and we are on Vimeo as well. Until next time, this has been Values Unpacked.